Hey, a secret sidekick, where have you been? I've been away. I gotta go live with my Aunt Alicia now that my mama died. I don't know if I can be Spider Kid no more. It's okay, little man. We all gotta go somewhere sometimes. Did you learn how to count to 20 for me yet? Uh-huh. Well, that's good. I need a good counter to keep an eye on that side of town anyway. You with me, secret sidekick? I love you, Spider-Man. I don't want to go. I know, LaFrance, I know. But it's time for the two of us to go our own ways. Time for you to look after your Aunt Alicia and your Uncle Ray. You don't need me anymore. From now on, you're a big man, okay? Okay. And big men don't hug each other when they part ways. They don't? Nope. They shake hands. To begin our journey, we have to understand the complication that is the life of Peter Parker. From the beginning, the intention was that Peter Parker, after becoming the Amazing Spider-Man, would grow as a person. And not just maturity, but also physically. He finished high school before issue number 30, actually. He went on to college, made a life for himself, while Spider-Man was making a name for himself as a hero. That was the idea, after all, that Peter wasn't just a superhero with a secret identity. His secret identity had his own life the way that his readers did, facing the same troubles that they did. That was in part what made Spider-Man one of the symbols of counterculture in the 60s. He had fantastic powers, but he was otherwise just like you and me. And the fact that the hero wore a mask meant that, as the opening illustrated, how much he could be like you and me underneath, no matter who or what we were. Because of this, though, a hero who went from a teenager to a responsible married adult over time, the question that was bothering some people was, who is Spider-Man really? Because a lot of times when things aren't going well, the theory is, go back to basics. But the problem was, you can't agree on what the basics are. For some, the legitimate Spider-Man is the 15-year-old teenager. For others, it's the grad student living in a Soho loft with his new bride. For still others, it's a swinging young adult with a hot new girl as the plot would allow it. All of these were Spider-Man while he was on his journey, so all of them are indeed legitimate. By the same token, you can't say that the other ones are not. The same way that Peter Parker didn't have to be the man inside the mask, Peter Parker himself didn't have to be any one thing for the hero's fans. But, again, this was considered a problem for Marvel that, at the dawn of the 21st century, was reeling from bankruptcy and looking for a back-to-basics reassurance for its audience. A Spider-Man Chapter 1 a few years earlier had flopped in an effort to try to retcon the character and the events of the post-reboot era, when all of the Spider-Man books were canceled and then relaunched with new number ones for Amazing Spider-Man and the book called Peter Parker's Spider-Man. Well, it was so disastrous that, as some at the time noted, even people who had stayed through the infamous and never-ending Clone Saga didn't want to stay anymore. The character had been rescued from cinematic limbo, and the film rights had been sold to Sony for an upcoming film, and yet the character himself was floundering because the Marvel leadership was uncertain what to do with him. The decision was finally reached to do a small limited series of a brand new take on the character, not a retconning as last time, but rather a fresh slate take on the character, independent from the long-standing hero and the Marvel universe that he inhabited. This character appeared in Ultimate Spider-Man, and it gave us a young Peter Parker, now bitten by a genetically modified spider, as the upcoming film would likewise do. Ultimate Spider-Man, created by Brian Michael Bendis and Mark Bagley, was a hit and continued on long past when the series had planned to end. When the Sony film was released to overwhelming success, there was the classic character for old fans, now being written as a science teacher, that was scripted by J. Michael Straczynski and Paul Jenkins. And for all of the new ones, there was the easy to jump onto Ultimate Spider-Man. The Ultimate line, as it was now known, expanded, but then it began to wane as the decade went on. And during that time, a question began to arise, whether or not Ultimate Spider-Man had to be Peter Parker. The Ultimate Universe that had sprung up around him didn't have the same limitations after all. Killing off and replacing Captain America, for example, is not something that you can do permanently in the mainstream Marvel Universe. The icon needed to remain for, if nothing else, the tie-in merchandise, the adaptations, the general brand awareness. But there was already a Peter Parker as Spider-Man that was swinging around. Nothing would be harmed if his Ultimate Universe counterpart were to suddenly bite the dust. And if that were to happen, and a new Spider-Man were to arise, wouldn't that create a new opportunity? Because as established, in some sense, it didn't matter who was behind the mask, he was every man. Or put another way, the mask was the symbol about how any of us, no matter where we came from or how we got there, can rise to the situation and use their power to help make the world a better place. That the mask was the price of admission. You have the power. This is now your responsibility. The character created to now bear that awesome responsibility and carry on the legacy of Spider-Man was Miles Morales, a mixed-race teenager from Brooklyn. His father is black and his mother is Puerto Rican. But it was more than just handing him a suit and calling him Spider-Man. That wasn't enough. Spider-Man, despite being a wisecracking hero, was born in tragedy and motivated by failure. The obligation is born from knowing the price that had to be paid because of that failure. For Peter, that was Uncle Ben. For Miles, that was Peter himself. Because Miles had already gained his powers and decided that he wanted to just forget that he had them. Making him wonder then if he could have tipped the balance enough to allow Peter to survive his final battle, if he hadn't been the coward that he was. I'm not bringing that up to debate whether or not Miles' perception of himself is accurate in that moment. The point is, though, that is how he viewed himself. Peter's death is the catalyst to make Miles take on the mantle of the fallen hero, to fill the void that his passing left. Now, this move was naturally controversial, even when it was happening outside of the Marvel Universe. But Miles emerged as the most popular character in the Ultimate line, so much so that when Marvel decided to bring the imprint to a close, Miles and his ensemble were drawn into the Marvel Universe proper. Peter Parker and Miles Morales can now coexist as different Spider-Man, one the icon who had grown up, the other the teen that was trying to find his way. And so, Peter Parker remains Spider-Man in film adaptations. But it was quickly realized that Miles Spider-Man offered a fresh alternative on the character that wouldn't diminish the original. It was just a question of how to present that to the larger audience who would have this sprung upon them and may not understand the context. Where does this character come from? Because that could have negative consequences. After all, the live-action Green Lantern film, regardless of what other problems it had, was also accused of being racist because Hal Jordan was the protagonist. For a generation that had grown up with the DCAU, John Stewart was the only Green Lantern as far as they were concerned. Who the hell was this Hal guy? If they went with Miles, most of the world would be left scratching their heads, wondering why Spider-Man was not Peter Parker. It wasn't the safe choice by any means, and if they did do it, they would need to find a way to get people up to speed on why the Spider-Man that they all knew was suddenly not Peter Parker. Fortunately for Miles, he had Phil Lord and Chris Miller in his corner. The creative pair had been behind not only the successful Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs and its sequel, but the Lego Movie, and perhaps more relevant, the Lego Batman movie, which managed to find an angle on its title character that hadn't been pursued before on the big screen. The two loved the character of Miles and thought that the idea was to really lean into it, to not only have the Spider-Man film not be about Peter Parker, but to make it, in their own words, a postmodern Spider-Man that recognized the numerous Spider-Man versions that were out there. This would offer numerous opportunities. First, as discussed, is the idea that the person behind the mask matters only in that it shows how any of us can rise to that. And so we see others in addition to Peter Parker who rose to take on that responsibility. But it also shows that Miles isn't a knockoff to be merchandised. He's part of a larger family that reflects the popularity of Spider-Man. After all, the many members of the Bat family don't diminish the popularity or originality of Batman himself. But perhaps most importantly, this move allowed a different take on the superhero origin story. While the experienced heroes would be on hand to save the day, Miles is still committed to being a part of it, still determined to help save the day even when they stop believing in his ability to keep up with them. Often, the hero in such films must take action because no one else can. Miles would do so because he is compelled to help whenever help is needed. It's an integral part of his character. Remember, he blamed himself for Peter Parker's death. Uncle Ben died because of arrogance. Peter Parker died because of cowardice, but in both cases, it was because of the assumption someone else is taking care of this. That's the reason the defining word for the character of Spider-Man is responsibility. The major challenge that Miles brought on board for them was that practically everything short of his racial background was used for the MCU Spider-Man. Even Ned is clearly Miles' friend and roommate Genki from the comic. With everything that had set Miles apart strip-mined already, there was no choice but to expand upon his personality. For example, they gave Miles artistic skills, which would actually play a significant role for the character. In the comics, Miles attempts to pay tribute to Peter by using a copy of his costume, but this so offends Peter's old fighting companions that he's nearly permanently benched. And even when he is permitted to continue, his costume is replaced by them, not by him. But in the film, having established Miles as an artist who wants to express himself, who wants to leave his mark upon the world, Miles makes his own Spider-Man costume, just like Peter made his when he had started out. Because the film was about Miles and not about Peter Parker, they had an infinite number of options for choosing the iconic hero. As I said at the beginning, Spider-Man has been all kinds of things throughout the years, and the alternate universes that we discover in the comics, more on that in a moment, establish that there is a wide variety of Spider-Men to choose from, even those who aren't Peter Parker. But if you are going for a Peter Parker, you can pick the one that best fits your story. In this case, they actually went with two. The main one that they were going with for the film was a past his prime Peter Parker, one who had made a lot of bad choices in his life. In order to contrast him, the filmmakers created what they called R.I. Peter, the one who was integral to Miles' call to action. Modeled after Brad Pitt in A River Runs Through It, this Peter Parker would instead be a prime physical specimen with good looks, a variety of suits and gadgets, and love and respect by the public. He was even voiced in an uncredited role by Chris Pine. The older Peter then arrives, and as they describe it, he's like LeBron James at the end of his career. He's earned his rep even if he's not exactly on the top of his game anymore. This provides a contrast for Miles to have to deal with. His dream mentor in his Spider-Man is the one who dies and leaves him with Hobo Spider-Man, who is sporting a bit of a gut and more concerned with chafing than getting out to thwart another evil plot in the nick of time. But a contrast was needed to that as well, and it was found thanks to the event which gave this film its name and at least the overall concept to it. Back in 2010, Dan Slott, longtime writer on Amazing Spider-Man, served as writer on a Spider-Man video game called Shattered Dimensions. While the story was considered a weak point by reviewers of the game, it nevertheless inspired Slott, because it featured 4 Spider-Men: the mainstream Peter Parker, the future Spider-Man 2099, the past Spider-Man Noir, and the alternate reality Ultimate Spider-Man, not Miles Morales, who did not exist yet. However, Slott felt this idea didn't go far enough. He didn't just like the idea of 4 Spider-Men teaming up, he wanted the crossover to feature all Spider-Men teaming up, and Spider-Women, and Spider-Whatevers. To do so, Slott built upon a concept previously explored, a being that consumed the essence of totems. That is, people with animal powers that have been bestowed in a mystical sort of form. The overlap between spiritual or mystical items in science is one that is much debated, both in fandom and in the comics itself. It's really not important. It's just that it gave the villains a simple motivation for the big Spider-Verse event. Essentially, they're vampires that prey solely upon spider people. Easy idea to understand, and being so powerful that it explains why they would all have to gather together for mutual defense and to eventually deal with their would-be murderers. And nobody is safe in this. Even the Spider-Man who would shill Hostess Twinkies in one-page comic ads is seen being killed by one of these villains, despite however many golden sponge cakes he might throw at him. In addition to seeking out every incarnation of Spider-Man that there was, even the Japanese one that piloted a Gundam-sized robot, new ones were created for this event. Evil, like Patton, a sociopath who gives into cannibalistic desires before mercifully being killed by the villains. Then there was the morally flexible, like the Spider-Man who learned the ways of assassins. And the last bastion of his world, Aaron Aikman with his collection of amazing gear. But there is no doubt that the breakout character of the event was Spider-Gwen, from the reality where it was she and not Peter Parker who had been bitten and attained the spider powers. The character's distinct look, which was absolutely nothing like the way Slott had envisioned her and he was initially aghast at, was nevertheless a huge hit with fans and was quickly spun off into her own works. She was a perfect addition to Into the Spider-Verse, able to serve a contrasting role to the other two main characters. She was far more experienced than Miles, perhaps someone around his own age that was nevertheless clearly on the top of her game. And while Peter had more experience, she wouldn't have the same emotional baggage that he was lugging around, and the subtle resentment of the responsibility that he had taken on with the Tights. Gwen was a reminder of what he was, and a sign of what Miles could be. The trio of primary spider people was good, but there was always this desire to see what could they get away with. So they decided to add 3 more to the mix in a minor role, enough to make an impact, but to mostly serve as the backup dancers to the main act. So given that limitation that they would be facing, it was important to make them noticeable and memorable. And so we wound up with 3 characters that would quickly catch the eye with their oddness and unique visual aspect. The aforementioned Spider-Man Noir was a natural choice, a character who played a prominent role in the Spider-Verse event, and a Peter Parker that was an even greater contrast than the 2 that we already had. Plus, he offered an interesting visual look to complement the piece. While the character typically had a black leather suit and mask, they based it upon this version seen here. They also decided to have him further embody the period, implying that he inhabited a world without color, and even discuss whether to make his voice sound like old-timey radio. Penny Parker, the 14-year-old schoolgirl psychically linked with the spider inside her robot, is not taken from some weird licensed Japanese take on Spider-Man like you might think. Penny was created for the Spider-Verse event. Though not attaining the extreme popularity that Gwen had, she held a minor role in the crossover. Penny is a Japanese girl with her father's exosuit, and in the comic was not drawn any different than any other Asian character. But the idea just sounded so very anime to the filmmakers, and they were looking to push the envelope as far as they could, so they decided to bring her in reinterpreted as an anime character, modifying the battle suit to be more like a piloted robot than an exosuit. The spider robot, spelled SP//DR, so I'm not going to hazard a pronunciation, played up the anime aspect by giving it a sense of personality and expressiveness, to show that there is a connection between Penny and it that goes beyond it as a mere machine, but that there was a friendship there in order to emphasize what happened to them during the film. Rounding this out was the oddest choice. It's Spider-Ham, a surprisingly enduring character created in a joke comic where everyone is an animal. Despite being made way back in 1983, Spider-Ham has continued to crop up throughout the years, even being voted by fans to appear as an alternate cover for a special Spider-Man event, even though Spider-Ham had nothing to do with the story. Keep in mind that Howard the Duck is part of the mainstream Marvel universe and has met everyone from the Hulk to Ghost Rider, so the frequent presence of a pig version of Spider-Man is not quite as crazy as it sounds. In bringing the character into the film, the emphasis was placed on his cartoonishness, enlarging his head and giving the body a plump appearance, rather than the more heroic build that the character had in the comics. But Spider-Ham was here for the laughs, after all, and part of that was merely his presence, and a symbol of the wild abandon behind the film. Says Phil Lord, "We have an anime character interacting with Spider-Ham, who is something out of a Rocky and Bullwinkle cartoon, next to a black and white character. You think to yourself, wow, it feels like nobody is supervising us. We're not supposed to do this." The decision had been made early on by Amy Pascal and Avi Arad for this to be an animated film, to allow for the unique visual opportunities that this could provide. This was taken further, to not only often give this a comic book feel complete with panels, but to give things visually that just weren't being done this way. Credit is especially given to Justin K. Thompson, the production designer on the film, Dean Gordon, the art director, and to bring their ideas to life, the team at Sony Imageworks. Thompson had worked with Lord and Miller on the two Cloudy films, so he had their firm trust in trying to find the tone for something fresh with this film. So he worked to emphasize the dirtiness and grittiness rather than the slickness and gloss that were common. Gordon, who also worked on the Cloud films, was on a similar page to push away from naturalistic art and the computer's tendency for realism and to instead make it feel more like a comic art, but without descending into a cartoon. And at Imageworks, they carried this forward by looking for ways to reverse what computers had done, which was perfection. They wanted to deliberately add imperfections to give it the human touch associated with the hand-drawn art that are the centerpiece of comics. In fact, Thompson gave a member of the team, Marcello Vignali, a special job: make an actual comic to put inside our comic book movie. Miles was to learn his connection to Spider-Man thanks to the comics made about the famous hero, and so Vignali created an origin issue, drawing on the art of Steve Ditko and John Romita Sr., right down to inking it by hand. This is indicative of what is the strength of this film. Many adaptations downplay comic book, fantasy, or science fiction connections that reflect their own biases towards the work. But the fact that everyone on board has embraced both heroes and comics was visible in every frame of the film. The crossover mechanism for the film is the Super Collider built by Alchemax. To try to grasp the enormity of it, the team actually visited the Large Hadron Collider for inspiration. This would help create one of the most memorable villains in the film, Dr. Octopus. Originally conceived as being much more like the dude from The Big Lebowski, the idea came to instead turn Doc Ock into a woman. There was initial skepticism, but Catherine Hahn's performance convinced the higher-ups that this could work, providing two different but clearly connected aspects, the scientist and the supervillain. To distinguish her from the traditional iteration of Doc Ock, her tentacles were based upon soft robotics, an actual new take on robotics that uses more organic-style materials for the flexibility options. It was easier to conceptualize than it was to actually create. The tentacles were so complex that each had to be rendered on a separate rig and color-coded to keep track of them. But this is another indication of the problems that they were facing making this film. Or I should say, challenges. The film was so crazy that the initial draft ended with Doctor Strange coming out, to essentially be the grown-up in the room after all these kids had been playing around with other dimensions. Indeed, the alternate universe nature was on display everywhere in subtle ways, such as the police who are about to arrest Miles identifying themselves as PDNY. But one of the most alternate was the appearance of Stan Lee. While he wasn't well during filming, they were able to get him to record the audio for his cameo. And that was important to them, as Stan had been a force of encouragement during the times that they crossed paths on their way up the career ladder. So having him actually in the film was very meaningful, especially given that this was near the end of his life. That's why I say Stan is the most alternate, because everybody wanted to have a chance to draw the beloved Stan Lee. So, basically, if it's not alternate reality, Stan just loves riding trains and buses all day long. The animation was worked with a less is more approach, despite the visual complexity that we see in the film. While there often looks like a lot of activity going on in the background, much of this was intentionally reduced to color blobs or static images that were given motion. For example, the occupants of a bus are static, but the bus is moving, and moving too fast for that to be noticed. Beyond the bus, the appearance of traffic is just a great deal of moving color blobs, so that the primary focus draws the eye, and the brain then fills in the blobs as cars and pedestrians. This kind of shortcutting both contributed to the visual look of the film, as well as allowing resources to be directed towards the ambitious efforts that they were making that would have the viewer's full attention. But the tremendous challenge of all of this was the fuel for this film. In its conception, in its storytelling, in its look, Into the Spider-Verse sought a way to do things that hadn't been done before. The idea of going into the superhero film genre, which had seen so much activity, especially since the dawn of the 21st century, and trying to find new angles and what to say and how to say it, motivated them to always find the novel choice to give the audience as a whole new experience. A loner who is suddenly the middle-aged mentor to a committed but scared kid with the entire universe at stake? That wasn't typical, especially for a character who was normally portrayed as the kid. The desire to make a comic book-inspired movie look like a comic book, even if it was in motion. The drive to push technology to make the strange or impossible look completely plausible. Into the Spider-Verse was as chaotic as the crossing multiverse, but ended with something that excited audiences and countless accolades. It was the best animated feature for the Academy Awards, the Annie Awards, the Saturn, the Hugo, the Golden Globes, and dozens more. All for a film about superheroes, interdimensional travel, and an anthropomorphic pig. Into the Spider-Verse showed that, despite the lamentations of some critics, there was still plenty more that the genre had to offer, and that there is room in the hearts of cinema-goers everywhere for what might otherwise be labeled a derivative character, so long as you give them a story as fantastic as their abilities. Tomorrow, we'll take a look at the film itself, Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse.